A woman with no eyebrows stepped off. A rancher with no beard smiled back. The gate hinge was what I heard first that morning. Not the train. The train had come and gone already, and I hadn't bothered to look up from the post I was resetting in the east corner of the yard. Gate hinge was what I heard, the particular squeal of mine, different from any other gate hinge in the territory. I'd know it in my sleep, and I stood straight and turned around. She was already 10 feet inside my property. No horse, no wagon waiting at the road, no man beside her. One bag, dark leather, worn at the corners. She wore a gray traveling dress that had seen better country and a hat with a ribbon that had come half loose and was lying flat against her cheek. She was walking toward the house like she'd been told there was something worth finding there, though I couldn't imagine who would have told her that. I set the post driver down in the dirt. She stopped when she saw me stop. Neither of us said anything for a moment. The wind came through the cottonwoods along the creek and made the only sound there was. Then she said, "Are you Caleb Marsh?" I said I was. "I was told you might have work." I looked at her, really looked, which I don't do with strangers before I've had time to read them a little. She was younger than I'd first thought, early 30s maybe, with a pale, still face and dark eyes that didn't look away. And I noticed, standing there in the morning sun, that she had no eyebrows, not shaved, not plucked. Just absent the way skin sometimes is after something takes them, a burn, a sickness, something she'd been through that left that particular mark. It gave her face an open, almost severe look, unguarded in a way that had nothing to do with innocence. She didn't flinch at me noticing. Most people look away when you see it. She didn't. I said, "What kind of work are you after?" She said, "Whatever kind you have." That was Nora Voss. That was the first morning. I should tell you something about the place first, because it matters to what came after. The Marsh Ranch sat on 460 acres of short grass plain north of Caldwell, which in the fall of 1882 was a town that had lately convinced itself it was becoming civilized. There were 3 churches, a new brick courthouse, a school that had operated for 2 full years without the teacher quitting, and a newspaper that had once called me in print the most obstinate landholder in the county. I'd framed that. It hangs in my kitchen to this day. I'd run the place alone for 6 years at that point. Before that, with my brother Elias until the consumption took him, and before that with our father until he died at 63 with his boots on and a load of fence wire in his arms, which is exactly how he'd have chosen to go. 3 generations of Marshes on that land. I was the last one. I didn't keep a lot of help. 2 hands in the busy season, sometimes 3. A woman named Guadalupe Reyes came from town twice a week to cook and clean, and she was worth more to me than most men I'd hired. But she had her own family and her own house and her own life, and she made it plain every day that she was extending me a courtesy, not an obligation. I was grateful for it. I didn't try to make it more than it was. The work Nora was asking about was real work, not charity. I want to be clear about that because some people in town later suggested I'd taken her in as some kind of good deed, and that irritated me then and irritates me now. I needed someone in the house. Not cooking, Guadalupe handled that, but the kind of work that accumulates when one man runs a working ranch and doesn't have hours to spare for the 100 small things a house needs. Mending harness, keeping the smokehouse organized, salting meat, washing equipment, reading through contracts that pile up because paperwork gives me a headache and I put it off. Real work. I'd been meaning to find someone for 2 months. I told her that. She said, "I can do most of that." I said, "Most." She said, "The meat. I don't know anything about salting meat." I said that was fine, I'd show her. She moved into the back room that same afternoon. I learned about her gradually, the way you learn about anyone you work alongside. Not from what they say, but from how they move. What they do when they think no one's watching, what they're careful about and what they're careless about. She was careful about waste, careful about other people's time. She asked before she touched anything that wasn't hers to touch, which sounds like a small thing, but on a working property it's not. It means the person understands that things have order and reason, and that their assumptions about that order might be wrong. I'd had grown men who never figured that out. She was careless about herself, ate without seeming to care much what it was. Slept on the narrow cot in the back room and never once complained, though I'd slept on that cot myself once when the roof over my room was leaking, and I'd woken up with my hip feeling like someone had been at it with a hammer. She wore the same 3 dresses in rotation, and mended them so neatly the men's were almost invisible, which told me she'd done a lot of mending in her life. After the first week, I asked about her people. She said her husband had died in the spring. Fever. They'd been moving west from Ohio when it took him, and she'd made it as far as Caldwell on the money they had left, and then the money had run out and she'd asked around and someone had mentioned my name. I said I was sorry about her husband. She said thank you, and that was all. No tears, no elaboration. Not because she was cold, I came to understand that later, but because she'd already spent a long time with it and she wasn't going to perform it for me. I respected that. The trouble started in October. A man named Harlow Pitch owned the land directly south of mine, about 600 acres of it, though half of it was scrub and hardpan that wouldn't grow grass if you begged it. He'd been trying to buy me out for 3 years by then. I'd declined. He'd come back lower. I declined again. He'd sent a lawyer. I'd sent the lawyer back with a letter that was not polite. Pitch didn't like being told no, and he particularly didn't like being told no by a man who seemed to have very little trouble telling it to him. He came to the ranch on a Tuesday in October, mid-morning, with 2 men I didn't know. I was in the barn when I heard the wagon. I came out. He was already in the yard. Pitch was a big man, wide through the chest, with a blonde beard going gray and the kind of eyes that are always working out what something is worth. He looked at me, and then he looked past me at the house, and I knew he'd already seen Nora through the kitchen window. He said he'd heard I had a new woman working for me. I said that was right. He said he'd also heard she was a widow from back east. No people out here, no money. I said I'd heard that too. He said he was in need of a housekeeper himself, and he was prepared to pay better than whatever I was paying, and maybe the lady would like to hear his offer directly. I looked at him for a moment. Then I said, she's busy. He said he'd wait. I said, she's going to be busy all day. He and I looked at each other for a while after that. The 2 men with him were watching me the way men watch when they're trying to figure out if a situation is going to go sideways and what their piece of it will be. I didn't look at them. I kept my eyes on Pitch. He said, Marsh, I'm just making a business offer. I said, I heard you, and I'm telling you she's not available. She works for me. That's a settled matter. Now I've got things to do. He held for another few seconds. Then he smiled, the kind of smile a man makes when he's decided to wait you out, and he climbed back up on the wagon and they left. I went back into the barn. I stood there for a while, not doing anything in particular, just letting the feeling settle out of me. After a while, I heard her footsteps on the barn floor. She came and stood in the aisle. She said, I heard some of that. I said, all right. She said, you didn't have to do that. I said, he'd have made you feel like a commodity. I didn't want you to have to sit through that. She was quiet a moment, then she said, I've sat through worse. I said, I know, but not on my property. Pitch didn't come back right away, but things got harder. The first thing was the water. We shared a creek that ran along the property boundary, the Sandhill Creek, and in November he put up a partial dam on his side that slowed the flow to my stock tank. Legal, technically, his water rights were legitimate, but he'd never done it before and there was no practical reason for it that made any sense. It was a message. I rode down and looked at the dam and rode back and started hauling water by hand to the tank while I worked on an alternate route from the main draw. That took 3 weeks and was one of the harder 3 weeks of work I'd done in recent memory, because the ground by November was starting to freeze at night and the digging was miserable. But I got it done. Nora helped where she could. She wasn't a strong woman, she was lean and had no great physical force, but she was steady and she didn't manufacture reasons to stop. She hauled water alongside me in the evenings when her inside work was done, and she never said a word about it being hard or cold. One night, coming back from the tank, she slipped on ice I hadn't seen and went down hard, catching herself with both hands, and I got to her and helped her up, and her palms were bleeding a little from the gravel. I held her wrists and looked at them in the lantern light, and they were shaking, not from fear but from cold and the shock of the fall. I got her inside and cleaned the cuts at the kitchen table. She sat there without making a sound, just looked at her own hands while I worked. She said, I'm not fragile. I said, I know. She said, I just need you to know that. I said, Nora, I know. She looked at me then. Just for a second, the way people look at you when they're checking whether you mean what you said. And then she nodded and looked back at her hands. The second thing was talk. Caldwell was not a large town. It had the usual ecology of a small town, people who minded their own business, people who didn't, and a few who made an active industry of other people's affairs. The word that got around, I learned later from Guadalupe, was that the widow woman out at the Marsh place was of uncertain character. No one said it plainly because they were too careful for that, but the implication was there. A woman alone, no family, living on a man's property, and that man a bachelor. What were people supposed to make of that? I heard about it third hand and let it sit for a few days, trying to decide how much it mattered. The answer was, it mattered some because it would matter to her, and I didn't want her to be walking into town for supplies and having women look at her sideways. She'd come here to make a start, not to inherit a new kind of trouble. I went to see Reverend Hatchard, who I was not in the habit of visiting because we disagreed on most things, and he was aware of it. I told him the situation plainly. Mrs. Voss was a widow who had lost her husband on the trail, who was working for me honestly and earning her wages and causing no one any difficulty. And if the church had something useful to do with its time, it might make that known. He heard me out. He was a dried-up little man with a good mind behind the dried-up exterior, and after a moment he said, "You've grown fond of her, Caleb." I said, "I haven't formed that opinion yet." He gave me a long look that suggested he thought I was lying to myself. I didn't argue. He said he'd speak to it. He did. The talk didn't stop entirely, but it quieted. People in a town will follow the opinion of whoever they've decided is credible, and Hatchard was credible enough. The third thing was the offer. In December, a man I'd never met came to the ranch. Young, late 20s, on a good horse, dressed in clean clothes that hadn't been worked in. He said his name was Dearborn, and that he represented certain business interests in the county, and that those interests had authorized him to offer me $12,000 for the Marsh Ranch, to be paid in cash within 30 days. 12,000 was a real number. It was more than the land was worth on a cold appraisal. I said no. He said his principals had instructed him to inform me that the offer had a short window, and that if I declined, conditions in the county might become less hospitable for independent ranchers. I said, "Did your principals use the word inhospitable, or did you add that yourself?" He said his principals had used the word. I said, "Well, you can tell your principals that the Marsh family has held this land for 31 years and intends to hold it 31 more, and that if they have further thoughts on the subject, they're welcome to come say them to my face." He left. That night at supper, I told Nora about it. I don't know why exactly. I wasn't in the habit of talking about my affairs, and this was my affair, not hers. But she'd been here 2 months by then, and she'd seen the water trouble, and she wasn't a foolish woman, and I didn't want her to be caught off guard if things got harder. She listened without interrupting. When I was done, she said, "Are you going to be able to hold it?" I said yes. She looked at me. She had the habit of looking at people directly when she was deciding how much to believe them, and she turned that look on me now. Then she said, "All right." Just that, all right, like my saying yes was enough. I can't tell you exactly what that did to me. I'd had men work for me who doubted my decisions and went ahead anyway, and that's a different thing. She wasn't going ahead anyway. She believed me. She'd looked at me and taken what I said as the truth of the matter, and that was all she needed. Nobody had looked at me quite like that in a long time. January was hard. The cold came down in the second week and didn't let up. Temperatures that made the air hurt your face and wind off the plains that found every gap in the barn walls and every loose board in the house. We lost 2 calves in the first cold snap, found them frozen in the far pasture, which happens and is a loss you absorb, but it never feels like nothing. I brought the remaining cattle closer to the barn, and we burned through wood faster than I'd planned. Nora was good in a crisis. Not dramatic about it, just efficient. When the pipe to the kitchen froze, she didn't stand there waiting to be told what to do. She got rags and hot water and went at it and had it clear before I'd had time to think through the approach myself. When the barn roof started showing ice stress, I got up there with a long-handled brush, and she stood below and told me when the sections were clear, walking the length of the barn in the cold with her head tipped back. Her breath made plumes in the air. She was wearing my old coat, the brown one I'd stopped using because one of the buttons had gone, and she'd replaced the button herself with one from her sewing kit, a slightly different shade, and she'd never mentioned it. I thought about that button more than a sensible man would. One night in the deep cold, this was late January, ice on the inside of the windows, we sat by the kitchen stove after supper and neither of us seemed to be in a hurry to move. She was mending a harness strap by the lamp. I had a cup of coffee that had gone cold and I wasn't doing anything with it. The stove made its ticking and settling sounds. She said without looking up from the strap, "Can I ask you something?" I said she could. She said, "Why haven't you ever married?" I said, "That's direct." She said, "I've been wondering for a while." I thought about it. There are questions you deflect without thinking, because you've deflected them so many times the deflection is automatic. This time, the automatic thing didn't come. I said, "I never seemed to settle on the right person, and then time went along." She said, "Is that the reason, or is that the way you've told it?" I looked at her. She was still looking at the harness strap. Her fingers were moving through the stitch carefully. I said, "I suppose I didn't think I was worth settling on." She went still for a moment, just a moment. Then she went on stitching. She said, "That seems like the wrong conclusion." I said, "Maybe." She looked up then. The lamp was between us and it lit her face from one side. And without the eyebrows, her face had that particular quality of being hard to read at a glance. You had to look slower, look at the eyes, look at the set of the mouth. And when you saw everything, she was feeling plain as print. She said, "I've worked for 3 men since my husband died, Caleb. None of them treated me like you treat me." I said, "How do I treat you?" She said, "Like I'm a person who's capable of things, like what I think matters, like you'd rather tell me the truth than manage my feelings about it." I held that. She said, "I don't think that's a small thing, in case you were wondering." I set the cold coffee down. I said, "I wasn't trying to do anything particular. I just thought you'd want to know what was happening." She said, "I know, that's what I mean." The thing with Pitch came to a head in February. 3 of his men came onto my land in the north pasture. This was a Saturday late morning, and I was in the barn. They said they were checking a fence line for their boss, except the fence line they were checking was 30 feet inside my property, and they knew it. I told them to get off. One of them, a thick man with a scar across his chin, said they'd be on their way once they'd confirmed the line. I said they could confirm it from the other side of it. He said that wasn't convenient. I had a rifle on the wall of the barn and a handgun on my belt, and 2 of my hired hands were over at the east side of the property, and I was alone with these 3 men, and the thick one was watching me with a calculating look that I'd seen on men before when they were deciding if a situation was going to cost them anything. I've been in enough of those situations to know when it tips. I said, "I'm going to tell you once more to get off this land. After that, I'm going to make my feelings on the matter plainer." He looked at me for a while, then he looked at the other 2. Then they left. I stood there after they went and I noticed my hands were steady. They've always been steady in the moment. It's after that they sometimes shake, and I won't pretend they didn't. I went back to the barn and started working on a piece of harness I didn't need to work on, just to give my hands something to do, and after a while Nora came in from the house. She'd seen them from the window. She stood in the barn door and said, "Are you all right?" I said yes. She said, "Are they going to come back?" I said maybe. She said, "What do you need?" I looked at her. She said, "I mean it. What do you need me to do?" Nobody had asked me that in a long time either. Not what do you want, not what happened, not how bad was it, what do you need? What do you need me to do? I said, "Right now I just need to finish this harness." She came in and sat on the stool near the workbench. She didn't try to talk. She picked up a piece of leather I'd cut earlier and started running a dressing cloth over it, slow, back and forth. We worked like that for a while, not saying anything. The barn was cold, but out of the wind. A horse shifted in his stall. The smell of the leather oil was good. After a while she said, "I'm not going to run." I said, "I didn't ask you to." She said, "I know, I'm just telling you." The following week I went to see Harlow pitch. I went alone early in the morning before he'd be expecting anyone. I tied my horse at his gate and walked up to the house and knocked. His housekeeper, an older Mexican woman who looked like she'd seen plenty and was not surprised by any of it, showed me in. He came out of his office in his shirt sleeves. He saw me, and his face went through several things quickly. I said, "Those men you sent to my north pasture." He started to say something about the fence line. I said, "Harlow, you've known where my fence line is for 20 years, so let's not do that." He looked at me. I said, "I'm going to say this once. This land isn't for sale. That's not stubbornness and it's not pride. It's just the truth. My father is buried in the east corner and his father's buried 20 feet from him, and I'm going to be buried there too, and whatever comes after me is going to be buried there. That's the end of it. What I need to know is whether you understand that or whether we're going to have further trouble." He was quiet for a long time. Pitch was not a stupid man. That had always been the difficulty with him. He knew when he was looking at something settled. He said, "You're going to make my life harder." I said, "Probably. I imagine you're going to return the favor." He almost smiled, almost. He said, "You've got a woman out there now." I said, "I do." He said, "She's staying." I said, "That's her decision." He looked at me for a moment with something I couldn't entirely read, something between irritation and a grudging kind of recognition. And then he said, "All right, Marsh, we'll leave your fence lines alone." I nodded. I put on my hat and walked back out through his house and got on my horse and rode home. I told Nora about it at supper. She listened. When I finished, she said, "Do you believe him?" I said, "I believe he's made a calculation. How long it holds depends on how the calculation changes." She nodded slowly. Then she said, "When you told him it was her decision whether I stay." I said, "Yes." She said, "Did you mean it?" I said, "Of course I meant it." She was quiet for a moment. She set her fork down. She was looking at the table, not at me, and I couldn't see her face well in the lamp shadow. She said, "I've been trying to decide what I'm deciding." I said, "All right." She said, "I think I've decided." I said, "All right." She picked up her fork again. She didn't say anything else for a while, and neither did I. The stove was going, and outside the wind was low, and the house was as quiet as it ever gets when the cold isn't pressing. I thought about asking. I didn't, because she'd said she'd decided, and I'd said all right, and that was enough for one evening. March came, and the ground started to soften. The world looks different when it starts to thaw. Not just cleaner, though it does get cleaner, the mud and the dark water channels and the brown grass coming through, but like something has been let out of a closed room. You forget every winter what it felt like to not be held in by cold. Then the first warm week comes and you remember. I was walking the east fence in the second week of March, looking for posts that had heaved in the freeze, when I came over a small rise and saw Nora standing at the edge of the creek. She hadn't heard me coming. She was just standing there looking at the water, which had finally unfrozen enough to move again, and she had her coat open in the warmth and her face up in the sun. I stood there for a moment up on the rise watching her. She was still. After a while she must have felt it, because she turned and saw me. I walked down to the creek bank. She said I was watching the water. I said, "Good place for it." She looked at the creek again for a moment, then she looked at me. She said, "I've decided to stay. I wanted to tell you plain." I said, "I'm glad." She said, "I know you haven't. I know neither of us has said anything about what that means exactly. I just wanted you to know the staying part was settled in case you were." She stopped. "I didn't want you to be uncertain about it." I looked at her face in the morning light. The pale skin, the open, unguarded look, the dark eyes that didn't look away. I said, "I appreciate that." She said, "You don't have to be careful with me, Caleb. I'm not going to misunderstand something." I said, "I know you're not." She said, "Then say what you mean to say." I thought about it for a moment, not because I didn't know what I meant to say, but because I wanted to say it right, without dressing it up in something it wasn't. I said, "I think you're the most capable, most honest person who's been on this property in as long as I can remember. And I think you already know the land better than some men I've paid wages. And I think this winter would have been harder without you. And I think I'd like it very much if you were here for the spring." She was quiet. She said, "That's a real thing to say." I said, "I meant it to be." She looked out at the water for a moment. Then she took a step toward me, just one step, and put her hand against my chest. Not a dramatic thing, not a gesture from a story. just her hand flat against my chest like she was taking the measure of something, feeling whether it was solid. I put my hand over hers. We stood there like that for a while at the creek, in the first real warmth of the year. I should tell you how it went after. Pitch stayed off my fence lines. Not because he became a different man, he didn't, but because he was a practical man, and what he'd calculated was that I wasn't going to move. You can't argue a man out of his own land once he stopped having the argument in his head. I'd stopped having it a long time before. He must have finally seen that. Dearborn came back in April with a lower offer, which was interesting. It meant the interests he worked for were uncertain now, which meant they'd been betting on breaking me and they hadn't, which meant their position was weaker than it looked. I told him the same thing I'd told him in December, only shorter. The creek ran clear all spring. The calves came in strong. I hired a third hand in May, a young man from Kansas named Ruiz who could ride anything and didn't talk much, which I liked in a person. Guadalupe came out on a Tuesday in June, looked at Nora and looked at me for a long, assessing moment, and then said something to Nora in Spanish that I wasn't meant to understand but mostly did. It was something to the effect of, "This one's worth keeping and don't let him be too proud to know it." Nora laughed. She had a good laugh, low and real. I'd been hearing it more. We married in July. Hatchard did the service in the yard with the cottonwoods in full leaf and the good smell of the grass after recent rain. My hands were there. Guadalupe brought her daughters and a cake that was better than anything I'd had in years. A few people from town came, the ones who'd been decent, and there was none of the talk that there might have been because there was nothing to speculate about now. It was plain. After, when the people had gone and the evening had come down and we were sitting on the porch in the last light, she leaned against me. Just leaned her shoulder into mine, looking out at the grass. The light was going gold on the far hills. I had my land. I had my fence lines. I had 31 years of family in the ground under the east corner and the years ahead stretching out ahead of us on the plain. And I had this woman, this particular woman, spare and honest and stubborn and real, with her shoulder against mine, and her hand in my hand, and her choosing to be exactly where she was. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. The cottonwoods moved in the evening wind and the light went off the hills, and we sat there in the going dark, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was the whole world, really, if you looked at it right.